My name is Susan Hawthorne and I'm publisher at Spinifex Press. Today we are having an in-conversation between Max Robinson, the author of Detransition, Beyond, Before and After, and Julie Bindel, famous journalist from the UK, and her latest book is called Feminism for Women. I want to begin with an acknowledgement of land. We respectfully acknowledge the wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their custodianship of the lands and waterways. The lands on which Spinifex offices are situated are Jiru, Bunurong and Wurundjeri, Wadawurrung, Eora and Noongar. We also acknowledge the many women throughout history who have fought for women's freedom and the freedom of lesbians, often at the cost of their lives. Today, we're absolutely thrilled to have this in conversation between Julie Bindel and Max Robinson to celebrate the publication of Max's book, Detransition, Beyond, Before and After, which is already out in Australia. It's available in the UK and it's due for release very soon in the USA and Canada. There is always a slight time delay for overseas releases, but don't worry, you can buy it in your area. And here is a beautiful cover of the book. I wish I'd had a copy of Max's book a couple of years ago, because it is such an important analysis of the ways in which the trans industry pulls in young lesbians. It's a great thing to know that just as radical feminism saved many of us in the 1970s and 80s, it continues to do so. So to begin, I'm going to introduce Max and then I'll introduce Julie and then I'll hand over to the two of them to talk to one another. So Max Robinson became involved with lesbian feminism in an effort to make sense of her experiences with medical transition. She found it accomplished that and then some. Max provides direct support services for developmentally disabled women. She lives in Oregon with her partner Kitty, their dogs, cats, and captive bred Ophiuchia shrimp. Her other work includes a book of collages, Why Is This Woman Smiling?, first person dog poetry, Laika, and lots of little sculptures. So I want to meet sometime these shrimp.
The shrimp are awesome. The shrimp are what's up.
That's great. Julie Bindel is a journalist, writer, broadcaster, and researcher. She's been active in the global campaign to end violence towards women and children since 1979 and has written extensively on rape, domestic violence, sexually motivated murder, prostitution and trafficking, child sexual exploitation, stalking, and the rise of religious fundamentalism and its harm to women and girls. Julie has authored over 30 book chapters and reports on a range of topics relating to violence and abuse of women and girls. She writes regularly for The Guardian newspaper, New Statesman, Truth Dig, The Sunday Telegraph, and Standpoint magazines, and appears regularly on BBC and Sky News. Julie was visiting journalist at Brunel University from 2013 to 14 and visiting researcher at Lincoln University from 2014 to 17. Julie is co-founder of Justice for Women, which was set up in 1990 in response to cases of spousal homicide in which men killed their female partners and were given sympathy and understanding by judges and jurors, in contrast to women who killed their male partners or ex-partners after suffering domestic violence and abuse and were punished disproportionately by the criminal system. And she's had several successes in that area. In Australia and New Zealand, her book, The Pimping of Prostitution, is available from Spinifex Press, and her latest book, Feminism for Women, has just been released in the UK, and it's another great read. So, Julie, over to you to begin the conversation.
Thank you very much, Susan, and congratulations, Max. It's a great book, and thank you for writing it. Would you introduce yourself? Just tell us a little bit about who you are.
Okay. I'm Max Robinson. I work in disability support services, and I, did the trans thing and stopped.
Tell me why you wrote the book, because it's such a fantastic, comprehensive read, and I learned so much from it. So tell me about the process building up to sitting down and actually getting it written.
Like the experience with, coming to realize transition wasn't working, and there actually being, very fortunately, a community of women who were thinking about that and talking about that from a second wave, like lesbian feminists, very influenced perspective. Like, I think honestly, if there weren't women already talking about that, I probably would have just stayed, being FTM, which wasn't working for me and would not have gone well. But I mean, meeting women who had the experience and were making sense of it and getting to exist in community with them definitely was what made it possible.
I'm 59 years old, so we're different generations. But I think growing up in the 70s as a young lesbian, had I been offered the option of just opting out of girlhood, womanhood, I think I would have taken that had it been available. What actually saved me was meeting lesbian feminists. Tell me a little bit, if you would, about your decision to transition and what external pressures there were kind of giving you that voice in your head to do it.
Yeah, I mean, everything, it just seemed like the thing to do, right? It just did not seem like a good option to not transition, frankly. There wasn't it I didn't really have a vision for what growing up to be a lesbian would look like or how it could turn out well. And I had, tried coming out as a lesbian, and it really didn't pan out, especially. And it just seemed like, it's all the steps like feel so good. Like, it's like the idea that there's these things you can do, and at the end you're happy, And that's really appealing when the alternative is a lot more open-ended and there doesn't seem to be a lot of support and narrative around it. From the perspective of me then, where I didn't really have much understanding of feminism or lesbian feminism at all. So
when you were thinking about yourself as a lesbian, did you have an idea of how difficult that might be, about the context in which you would come out? You just said something really interesting, which is that you didn't have a good idea about how being a lesbian would work out for you. It's interesting, isn't it, that we have so few lesbian role models, and that we have so many women that are identifying as non-binary or queer, and the word lesbian hasn't been used. What did the word lesbian mean to you at the time that you were thinking about transitioning?
It seemed lame. I don't know. I didn't think it was cool, like I didn't have a positive evaluation of lesbianism, and to the extent that I did, it felt like something that was like too cool. It was either I don't want to be a lesbian or I'm not good enough to be a lesbian. It's just like flip-flopping between those. I don't know. It's like I remember being like I learned about trans stuff from Autostraddle, because I was like, oh, lesbian stuff, and then half the content is about trans stuff, and I'm like, oh, I think actually my suffering might matter, so that's probably more about me. So
Wow, that is really scary, isn't it? That publications, the online publications, websites, whatever, draw you in as someone who's thinking about your lesbian identity, and then captures you with a lot of the trans stuff. Would you say that was too strong a way of putting it, or is that Is that pretty much how it was?
I mean, it was, honestly. I mean, I don't know. I had heard of it before, definitely. And it was, kind of growing. It was becoming more and more. Because, I mean, the whole thing with the trans thing is it's just a different paradigm for understanding, like you said, feelings that a lesbian would have in the 70s or 80s, but not necessarily have the language of transition to describe, and would then have a different process for handling those feelings, end up with a different result. But when you've got like the transgender paradigm, then that is pretty appealing. There's steps and you complete them, and at the end you can be happy and be yourself. So that's a cool story, and you want to believe that about yourself.
Well, my experience was that when I was identified by boys at my school, I grew up in a very working class area, went to a very poor school. And when boys realized that I wasn't interested in them, and they probably had heard rumors about me having a crush on my best friend, that kind of thing, then the insults, the bullying and the abuse started. But the thing that I hated most of all was the word lesbian. To me, it was a terrible, terrible word, like the worst word. But the other thing was I was told that I must be a boy. You're not a real girl. Look at her, she looks like a boy. I mean, I didn't particularly in any way. But now that would be something that would lead many young women into thinking that they are, in fact, trans. What on earth has happened to butch lesbians, for example? What's happened to the lesbians who refuse to wear feminine frippery and are all of a sudden asked, when are you going to transition? Because they're proudly lesbian. I mean, how do you feel about that now?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I felt strongly, I felt good about being a lesbian at first, and then I came out as a lesbian and I felt a little, I don't know about all this. Got some feedback, right? But yeah, I definitely, as a kid, there's, I want to wear the clothes I like and not the clothes you're making me wear. And, when I said I was trans, that was when I got to, when I said I was trans, and then we went to the doctor and the doctor agreed I was trans. Once the doctor agreed I was trans, then I got to pick my own clothes, I got to get the haircut I wanted. I got to buy my clothes. So that was a pretty big win for me. It really worked for me in that way. And yeah, like people don't, and even now it's like, if somebody has, so I live in rural Oregon, so it's pretty strongly conservative. If someone doesn't have a concept of trans stuff, generally, they're kind of homophobic, which is a whole different thing, but they don't have difficulty understanding my narrative. Like they can grasp, I thought I was transgender and I stopped, I'm a lesbian now. They might not like it, but it's not confusing. They don't mess up my pronouns. They get, you have a fucking vagina. But they get it. They understand what I'm saying. Whereas if someone has a concept of trans stuff, they cannot believe that I'm a woman. Like they will not believe that I identify as a woman. They will literally ask my pronouns like 5 times. Like every 2 weeks, they'll ask my pronouns again. Like once someone has a concept that someone who looks the way I look and the way a lot of women look might not identify as a woman, they've just boxed you out of the category completely. They don't want to believe that anyone who looks that way will. I don't know. It's crazy.
There's so many women that I talk to over here in the UK that are asked constantly, have you ever thought about transitioning? When are you going to transition? And some of these women are lesbians. They're not feminists particularly. They might have quite traditional ideas about how lesbians should look, or, their relationships with other women. They might be a bit into the kind of butch femme stuff. And that's not my bag, but I have conversations with them all the time. And they are very, very angry about having their lesbian identity erased and questioned in a way that I see parallels. And this is what your book really clarified for me. I see parallels with the lesbians today that are being pressurized about the trans stuff, with when I was being told I wasn't a real woman, I must be a man, I was a freak, there was something wrong with me, I needed to go to the doctors. It's kind of different century, same shit. That's the way that I'm looking at it. Tell me, when you decided that you wanted to tell your story in a book, and it's a really powerful story, how did you kind of find it within yourself to lay the whole thing bare and work it out in the way that you have and get it down in that kind of very clear narrative that you did? Was it a quick process, or did you have to kind of have a few starts before you got there?
It was a nightmare. I wrote it like during downtime at really intense caregiving jobs. I wouldn't have written it if my girlfriend hadn't very, very strongly encouraged me to for a really long time and been really, really helpful the whole time. And I wrote it at these caregiving jobs. So I'm writing it in these horrible little chunks that she then pieces into like a reasonable actual thing. It was really bad to start. But yeah, is existing in community with other women of the experience and getting to talk about it and getting to learn from each other and process it together and politicize the experience as a group and make meaning of things together was what made it possible. Like I would not have, I would have just stayed FTM. I would have just been a pretty unhappy and unfulfilled FTM as indefinitely, I think, if I hadn't encountered other women who were willing to talk about it.
So that's another bridge that we can identify between us. So across an ocean, across generations, that you're effectively talking about doing consciousness raising with women, which is how the movement began, how the second wave, as it's called, feminist movement began, where I came in towards the end of that process, where women were sitting around in groups talking about the politics of heterosexuality, the violence within their relationships, growing up as girls, how patriarchy affected us, but in really very kind of basic terms, with total solidarity and sisterhood, however different our experiences were. For me, that was invaluable. That's how I realized that actually we have common cause as women, because it's about girlhood, isn't it? And about what that's like under patriarchy. How did you manage to process that with the other women that you drew such strength from, when there must have been so many different views in the room about trans ideology, about feminism, about what lesbianism is? Just talk me through it, a little bit of that. Did you ever have any kind of conflicts that you had to resolve?
The lows are low, right? I think it's like all feminist organizing where there are just absolutely devastating lows, I think transitioning is an intense thing to do, and stopping transition is an intense thing to do. And women who do both are really kind of an intense group of ladies. I don't know, we go at each other. But a lot of the organizing was powered by a particular woman who stays pretty anonymous, but was really inspired by like Mitchfest organizing and kind of relied on a lot of like the social technology that Mitchfest developed over the decades. And I think that really helped with more of it staying on track than does a lot of the time. Definitely it got and gets messy at times, for sure, in a pretty big way.
Yeah, well, I can imagine, having been in similar situations, but like you say, it's an intense process. Who did you have in mind when you wrote the book? Because obviously, I've read it. I've never been through the whole transgender stuff, but engaged in the politics of it and the resistance to it. And I got a huge amount from the book. But who was in your mind as you were writing it? Who's the book for?
I think I couldn't really write it unless I was writing for a lesbian audience. I couldn't really get anything out. But I would hope that, I think lesbians writing for a lesbian audience, or whoever writing for the audience that they most want to write for, often produces work that can be more broadly useful. So I would hope that it would be useful to other women as well. I really wanted to produce something that would have been helpful to me personally, which obviously, everyone's different. So a lot of people aren't going to find that the most helpful, but I wanted to produce what I would have liked to have seen about it, because reading feminist theory was really, really helpful to me while I was trying to make sense of it. It really helped me understand what was going on and contextualize it with other experiences women had had. Not because transition kind of gets painted as this like off to the side, really freakish, weird thing, that really stands alone. And I think in reality, it just isn't that special. It sucks. Everything sucks in its own way, but it's not as special as we act like.
It's interesting that you talk about wanting to write a book that would have helped you. That to me is the absolute basis of feminism and feminist publishing and feminist writing, and it's what Spinifex does so well, isn't it? And I'm wondering what influenced you, if there were any books, any articles, any particular writers or speakers that influenced you when you were writing it. Did you draw from any of those sources?
Lesbian ethics, like the most, honestly. Like I was having a really hard time when I was writing it with articulating like any kind of positive vision for anything. You know, it's just like it's kind of depressing. There's a lot of downsides, and that was really helpful for me with finding something positive to say. You know, Eden Built by Eves, the discussion of like what worked about Mitchfest was really cool.
I mean, what is it, do you think? I know that we think we know, and people like me talk about this all the time. We haven't been through it. We haven't had testosterone. We haven't been, you know, identified as male in public. And, you know, we can't know until you kind of live that experience, really. But if you had to sum up what it is that attracts women, young lesbians, to transition, is there a neat way you could put that, or is it way too complex?
I mean, there are a lot of ones that are more common, but everyone's kind of, there's just so many routes to it now. Like I think like decades ago, it was really strongly lesbians, a lot of lesbians with a pretty similar family of body issues and everything, you know, but now it's broadening and broadening. And honestly, I think that's going to be a pretty big issue for them to overcome. I mean, the more like, it's one thing for a lesbian to make changes to her body that she doesn't feel good about 10 years later. It's going to be different when there's a bunch of straight women who want to have babies and can't. I mean, people are going to care about that in a way they just were never going to care about lesbians. And it's going to happen. I mean, it's becoming more and more accessible as a strategy for dealing with, you know, stress around your gender, stress around your body. I don't know. There's just so many routes to it. There's so many things that work about it for people. Like there's like the social angle of like, this is where the people are. There's the whole, it has a narrative. You can do these steps and you'll feel better. I mean, for me, a really big draw for it was that like your pain matters in that paradigm. Nobody fucking cared that I was a lesbian. Nobody cared that I was a lesbian. Nobody cared about the ways that was difficult for me. I was a teenager, you know, I'm cutting myself, I'm having all my teenage problems, and none of it was making an impression with anybody. And, you know, people didn't necessarily like it when I said I was transgender, but I made a splash, right? I got a reaction that felt proportionate to the level of distress I was experiencing, which I had never achieved, honestly, as a teenager. Nobody was impressed with the suffering. So I think it kind of puts language to the pain of being female that by making it not female makes the pain matter more to a lot of people.
That's really interesting. So I know you're right about this and really profoundly, but no one gives a damn basically about teenage girls. Very, very rarely, culturally, we abuse and treat teenage girls appallingly under patriarchy, because of patriarchy, obviously, which is why teenage girls are constantly told that they're lying when we're sexually assaulted, that our eating disorders are just selfishness. I mean, all of that kind of stuff. But that the attention and validation that you got as a trans identifying person filled a gap. And so it really challenged me in your book, because obviously we see some of those intensely privileged young women who come across as very narcissistic, very attention seeking, very, very kind of, I want to be seen as something extremely special because that's how I've been raised. But I really challenged myself on that reading your book, because yes, that type exists. That type always exists, whether they transition or whether they narc and attention seek in other ways. But how you've just described it and how you wrote about it is actually very painful, isn't it? That this is what it's another form of self-harm, I think, is what you're saying, but one way you will get the attention. Can you just talk a little bit to how that worked and then stopped working for you? Because as you say in the book, it just stopped working for you at some stage.
Right. I can't remember the term for it. I wish I could. But you know, there's like that idea that different cultures have different ways of communicating like emotional pain. And people tend to use the one that their culture uses because that's how you get it across. We're social animals. We want people to understand. So yeah, I mean, I think it just functions as a culturally significant in this moment way to communicate pain. What was the other part of your question? I'm sorry.
Just how did it stop working for you? So at the time you got the validation, but then it started to go wrong, didn't it?
Well, I mean, obviously everyone is different. It varies a lot, but there is kind of a trajectory that seems anecdotally to me pretty common, wherein it feels good while you're making progress, right? Like while you've got the steps in mind and you're making, you're obsessed with the next one, but you eventually achieve it. You're taking these little steps towards it. So for me, I did my name change, I took testosterone, I got my mastectomy, I changed my legal sex, I changed all my documents. Once you get to the point where you're kind of done with the stuff you wanted to do, whatever, that person's trajectory is, and you're kind of stabilized, it seems like there's kind of a several year countdown for a lot of people. I mean, once you reach the point that you wanted to get to, a lot of us kind of stall out there. And that can, you might not necessarily stop transition, but a lot of people, once they finish the steps they wanted to do, experience eventually kind of a shift in perspective about the whole thing to some degree or another.
One of the big debates that we've got raging over here, and I know that it's similar in different countries in the global north and the global south now increasingly, is that feminists are wrong when we say that it is way too easy to transition. So we've got this big thing going on with the Tavistock, the gender identity clinic for kids in London. And, there's been court cases, you'll know about the Keira Bell case, where she argued in court that you should not be putting kids on puberty blockers because 100% of them go on to do the mixed sex hormones. And she won her case, and then that case was overturned by the Tavistock on appeal, but they're taking it forward to the Supreme Court. But we've been arguing, not just in court, but socially as well, that when girls, young women, present to doctors, to medics, saying all the stuff that we know what to say about how really, you're a man, blah, 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 they get on testosterone, which, as we know, has a very powerful effect. Is that the experience you had? Because we're told all the time that it's way too difficult, that waiting lists are off the scale, that it's not easy at all to transition. Who's telling the truth?
It really varies, honestly. I mean, it's changing all the time and it just varies. I transitioned when I was 16. I had to go to a gender therapist for a couple months, and then I got a letter for blockers. And then I had to get more letters to get on testosterone. I had to get 2 more letters to get mastectomy. I mean, so there's a lot of hoops. And I did, jump through all the hoops. I don't know. I feel like those conversations are really hard because I think very poorly of these interventions. I really hate them. It did a lot of harm for me. And I just think, if you cut into anyone, they bleed. I think surgery is inherently, traumatic to your body and can be traumatic emotionally, even when it is absolutely needed and necessary. So I don't think highly of any cosmetic surgery or intervention. But at the same time, I think a lot of this comes back to this idea that we just need to fix the therapists and they need to be better therapists. And I think that's kind of misguided. My therapist followed all the standards. It wasn't that fast, really. If I had get in their paradigm where I'm a kid who's about to kill myself, it seems like a reasonable enough time frame. I don't know. I think we kind of need more social change than just changing the gatekeeping structure. And, the some, there's certain angles where it's trying to stop the insurance coverage. And it's like, honestly, people will just pay out of pocket and get predatory medical loans for it. It's just so convoluted. I don't know. It's a mess.
So what's it like living as a detransitioned woman, as a lesbian today? Was that a huge shift? And how is it coming back to you, or finding your identity, as you say in the book? You found yourself.
It's honestly, I mean, it was a big shift. It's crazy. It makes me feel pretty stressed out about people who transition as little kids, because I transitioned when I was 16. I wasn't even really passing until I was probably 17 or 18, really 18. And my concept of being a woman, being female, was being a teenager. It felt really scary because it felt like I was going to have to be a teenager again. I didn't have any concept of living as female that wasn't being a kid. So, I mean, when I think of that applying to someone who transitioned when they were 5, I mean, what does that feel like? I don't know. It's you just, when you're trans, it's like there's just this layer of obfuscation and inherent dissociation in relating to people. You've got this barrier that you can kind of always rely on as a safety thing. You can't talk earnestly about your childhood. You can't reveal different things about yourself. And I mean, for me at least, knowing that who I was presenting to them wasn't exactly true made me feel a lot safer. And losing that and presenting to people in a way that felt more honest was really vulnerable and scary. It felt like I had to be a kid again. It felt like I was losing this like security blanket of just lying, just lying about who I am. I'm not being myself. So what does it matter what they think of me? I don't know. It's really intense. And you never stop having to explain it to everyone. If you are visually distinct, I had a mastectomy, and I am not, I'm not a little lady who, I wouldn't be flat, you're always going to have to explain it. And I can see why people want to avoid that. But ultimately, the cost was too high. I couldn't if you check out of everything and you're always being someone you aren't, then you cheapen a lot of your experiences and relationships.
And what was it like? I don't ask this in a voyeuristic way. I ask this because there's been so much in popular culture about, a woman who dresses as a man and fools everyone for a day. There was a book a few years ago written about a woman who walked around New York City, passing as a man and then reporting back on those experiences. And that now feels like an age away, that anthropological exercise was done, bearing in mind, how many young women have transitioned. What was it like being read as a man and being accepted as a man? I don't mean a trans man, but where you passed and that's how you were perceived. Talk me through that a little bit, if you would, Max.
Passing sucks. It sucks. The experience of having women not trust you in the way they would if they thought you were female, meeting unfamiliar women and having them be guarded around you in the way they're guarded around men is, it feels so bad. I don't know. Nothing feels like that. And having men expect you to like when they act like men, I don't know. It's just wild. And I didn't really try that long to be read as a straight man. Like for a while I did, but it was so much work that, I was being read as, like a gay guy mostly, because I just couldn't keep up the voice, But yeah, it's horrible. I don't want to hear the stuff they say to each other, and I don't want women to respond to me that way.
So there must have been a sense that you were betraying not just yourself, but you were betraying women by kind of being in that male culture. That must have felt really quite profound. I mean,
yeah. I mean,
so did you feel like you'd betrayed yourself, or did you manage to externalize that as kind of blaming yourself for how women were responding to you?
I think that the betrayal thing is really loaded, because I think there's I wouldn't regard other women of this experience that way, but it definitely was something I felt about myself at the time. I mean, I don't think it's an attempt to preserve yourself. You're trying your best to protect yourself. So I don't want to say that it's inherently a betrayal that women do it, but to me, absolutely, that was my emotional experience of it. Yeah.
I mean, I reject the kind of allegation that's made by some women in the lesbian community that transitioned women have betrayed others. I totally and utterly reject that. Clearly, we understand how we feel can be in contradiction with our feminism. For example, feeling guilt when we're sexually assaulted. Doesn't matter how big a feminist you are, that feeling is really difficult not to take on. But that is something that I want to ask you about, where I have seen some really negative stuff. I mean, mainly massively positive about detransitioned women, about how you stand out, how you're public, you are brave, you are warriors. Then there's a little group of quite nasty kind of mean girls who do the whole, they've betrayed us. How could they do that? This is terrible. Do you ever come across any of that kind of negativity?
Yeah, definitely. There's just, I don't know. I think a lot of groups of people are, I don't know, there's just you want someone to pick on, I mean, and there are very real ways in which transition is not reflective of feminist values or of solidarity with women. I mean, it's not, it's a individual, it's a personal medical, like, kind of consumerist solution to the problem. So, I mean, there's an element of truth there. It's just that, everyone, the idea that women as a whole or lesbians as a whole are more hurt by someone's transition than she personally is. If you think transition is a bad thing, then the person who experienced her own transition is the most harmed by it,
Right. And also the fact that this only exists because of patriarchy. If it wasn't for male violence, if it wasn't for male dominance and women's subordination, we wouldn't want to opt out of it. But we also wouldn't want the sex stereotypes wouldn't exist that tells us what a real man is or what a real woman is. And somehow you can have this blue brain in a pink body and all that madness. But that, I think, brings us to a kind of contentious topic, which is, my view is that there are men that transition, claim to be women, who are massive misogynists, trans activists, harmful to women, sexual predators. All of that stuff is true. And then there are some men who went through sex change surgery, transition to live as women, who are victims of patriarchy and who've been massively let down by the medical profession, very much regret it, very much feel that they should have been allowed to live and thrive in the body that they had, with the sexual, with their gay identity in some cases, who I think are really unable to speak out for two reasons. The main reason being trans activism, extreme trans ideology, that means that if they speak out and say this is not a solution, that they will lose their friends, they will lose their community. And I think another reason is that some women who are just on the anti-trans train, that's all they do, that's their obsession, they don't do any other feminism, but they're just obsessed with the trans thing. They just paint them all as autogynephiliac rapists in waiting and reject the idea that there could actually be some men who, in different ways to women, are victims of patriarchy, which is why they went through this bullshit. I mean, do you have any feeling?
I just, I mean, someone can be a creep and still be medically abused also, I mean, it's not one thing or another. Somebody can be sexually predatory to women and be mistreated by a doctor, I mean, those aren't discrete, but yeah, no, I mean, there are a ton of men who are being harmed by gender norms and who a lot of the same appeals as for women, their experiences are different, but it's still there's a solution to your suffering. There's an identity you can take. There's a framework for your suffering that people will care about. I mean, it's really isolating to be, the one who you can't fit in anywhere. And if you're trans, then there's kind of a built-in support. But yeah, I mean, that was honestly the sexual misconduct by trans women in queer spaces was what made me start thinking about transition. I mean, I definitely, transition wasn't working for me anymore, but in terms of actually, that was a feeling that I really wanted to hide from. It wasn't something that I wanted to engage with. It was something that I was going to put off as long as I could. And my partner that I got with around, a year before I started thinking about transition differently, have been just horribly sexually abused and in a domestic violence situation with a trans woman. That was his behavior was very male. It was very stereotypically male. He had a porn addiction and he wanted to, harm her in ways that were modeled on this porn that he watched. He was physically much larger than her and menacing to her. He had the economic advantage in a pretty major way. He expected her to do basically housewife shit, and she had never dated a man before that. She had been a lesbian, she had known she was a lesbian her entire life. But this paradigm where trans women are these extra special women you have to feel bad for. And as a woman who had been very outcast for who she was and how she looked, it was a very compelling narrative to her that there were these women who had a really horrible time that you had to be considerate of. And it was messed up not to regard as women. I mean, she would never have been in that situation. She wouldn't have been with a guy if it weren't for the trans stuff. And so we got together because she came to live with me. She didn't have anywhere to go other than with this guy. And then a couple months after she moved in, which was already, I was like, this is kind of weird. Why are these guys acting like this? I hadn't really met trans women before I met her partner and her other partner at the time. And I met them and I was like, Jesus Christ, I mean, they're just horrible. They were horrible. But then after that, my friend, who was just kind of a regular lady, I mean, she wasn't identifying as anything but straight at the time. A guy was sexually violent to her. And when she spoke up about it, he immediately changed his pronouns to she. He didn't, medically or physically transition in any way that I know of, but, changes his pronouns to she. And it was like, well, she's misgendering me in this description of what happened. I mean, she's not using my pronouns. This is so fucked up. I'm a woman of color, and my friend wasn't white either. It was just this whole, game. And seeing that and seeing my partner, I mean, she couldn't make sense of what happened at all when she was considering this a lesbian domestic violence situation, which obviously happens and is very real, but the structure of a lesbian domestic violence situation is completely different to a male-female domestic violence situation. You can't make sense of being abused by a man while you're considering him a woman. I mean, it doesn't work. And seeing that play out, trying to be supportive of her and help her make sense of what had happened, and seeing the way this was just completely undermining her ability to understand her own life really kind of made me think differently about what we were doing with transition. I mean, we were both at the time, she was non-binary and was eventually, wanting to transition medically. Seeing it all play out like that was definitely what made me start thinking differently.
Which is why we need to keep men, however they identify, completely out of women's spaces. And I have seen dynamics like that play out, where there are men who consider themselves non-binary, bullying lesbians, young lesbians, by saying that they are more oppressed than the lesbians, who all of a sudden seem to have all this power, all this structural power. And like you say, and you say in your book very clearly, that you can't actually opt out of the socialization that you've had as girls and boys in this society. And that illustration about the trans woman and your partner is a perfect illustration of that. This is male pattern behavior and violence. And it must be really affirming to be in a community now of lesbians, of women who've been through transition, who've now come home and support each other. Tell me how that is, because it's a new community, isn't it? Relatively new.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, there's, there was a forum years ago, and then eventually there were in-person events that were really nice. We haven't done anything since COVID, and different I think there's a dynamic in a lot of feminist organizing where if you're the one that puts yourself out there a lot, you're kind of the one that everyone wants to, just eat alive. So there's kind of some difficulty with finding someone who wants to put themselves out there. um but yeah, I don't know. I don't think none of it. It's just like it's such a big risk to be that vulnerable and to try to be together, as feminists, as any particular kind of feminist. But the payoff is just so big.
Do you mainly organize online? Do you get together ever? I mean, I know it's been difficult with COVID, but how's that working?
In general, there was a yearly thing that I would go to, and that a lot of women went to. That was in person. A lot of it is online, and now, I mean, it's there's a lot going on online that I don't know about now. I mean, now it's the more people transition, the more people stop, and I think also the longer it goes on, the more people transition appeals to, and the more diverse of a group, it becomes. Like, I think the woman who stopped transitioning in the 90s or whatever, I mean, that was an even more uniformly lesbian group. And now there's more and more straight women who are having the experience. Yeah, I don't know. There's online, there's in person. At this point now, I'm not really participating in much of the group stuff other than, if there was an in-person gathering, I'd still go if it was COVID safe, whatever. But I mostly just have the friends that I have from it that I talk to, but there's a decent number of them.
Well, yesterday I was talking with someone about the way that gaslighting works with the language around trans ideology. For example, trans activists talking about healthcare when what they mean is surgery that is not necessary. And as you put it, cosmetic surgery or hormones. So stuff that's harmful, but they call it healthcare, like we might call, medication for asthma or diabetes or cancer or whatever. And it sounds quite compelling when you put it like that, doesn't it? Healthcare. But actually, healthcare really does apply to detransitioned women and men, obviously, but this is healthcare that you're having to access now. I mean, how do you see the future of developing treatment and medicine and aftercare for detransitioned women? It must be quite complex.
It'd be really great if we could do coalition work with transgender people on this. It'd be really nice if we could get along and play nice, because a lot of the needs are the same. A lot of things that detransition people need would improve healthcare for trans people. It'd be research. I mean, testosterone is not. I don't know anything about other countries. I'm very American, but it's not USDA. It's not FDA approved in the United States. It's not evaluated as a treatment for cross-sex administration in any way. It's literally just not evaluated. The blockers aren't evaluated. Estrogen isn't evaluated cross-sex. Testosterone isn't evaluated cross-sex. Like, that is a healthcare need we have in common. We should all be using evidence-based medicine that has been evaluated for the purpose it's being used for. A lot of people who are trans do stop hormones at some point in their life, permanently or temporarily. It would be useful for transgender people and detransition people to know what happens when you stop hormones, and to know what happens when you have a hysterectomy and you use testosterone after. There's a lot of these healthcare needs that we have in common, and that we should actually both sides be working for in unison and not in opposition to each other.
That's interesting, because I mean, we've obviously been desperately trying to have conversations with, there are a number of reasonable trans people who are not trans activists who want to talk about this stuff, and the extreme trans activists and the bullies, the misogynists are trying to stop that conversation. But I see your book as a really important part of that conversation. And I assume you hope that trans people will read it.
I would like if we could talk, you know? I mean, it's crazy. If you read stuff about transition from even just like the 90s, it's like there's not this sense of intense opposition to each other, to, you know, between, say, you know, a trans man and a butch lesbian, or a trans man and someone who stops transition. It's just kind of this culturally constructed just barrier between us, and we're on opposite sides of this debate. And it really just, I mean, it serves the like conservative Christian right more than anything else. Like they're really into the whole concept of, you know, the grouping together sexual orientation and gender identity laws, the SOGI laws thing is huge to them. Like they literally, if you go on the Heritage Foundation website, they're talking very explicitly and directly about how they want to pit elements of LGBT against each other so that we're not a cohesive lobbying group. So it's just, I really wish it'd be great if we could find a way to effectively do coalition work. I don't personally have a vision for the path to that right now, because it is a disaster. But there's a lot of things, there's a lot of common ground in terms of what outcomes we want. And I think that I wish we could focus on that more so than the coalition with right-wing groups that also want to undermine lesbian rights in every way they can.
I agree with you 100%. You are so right. It's a dangerous path. Our enemies use it against us. We're shoring up the power of those religious fundamentalists and right-wingers to stop access to abortion. And as you say, roll back lesbian rights and rights of women. So absolutely right on, Max. Tell me, just a final question. Tell me what your plans are for the future with this book. I mean, we'd love to get you over to the UK. We're going to really try and make that happen if you would be interested in a trip. You know, what is going to happen now? It's an exciting time, the launch of this book. So tell me your plans for that.
I have no idea. I will do whatever I can that they ask me to do. I will do my best to do whatever they ask me to do, but I have no idea.
So what would you like to happen? I mean, presumably you're going to get a thrill when you see your book in a bookshop, and you're going to want the reviews. You're looking to get feedback from readers. You know, how can we support you to get this book out as far and wide as it deserves?
You know, asking bookstores to carry it, buying copies. I don't know anything. Kitty's trying to do the marketing. I don't know anything.
Well, you know, you've got a great team with Spinifex, so I'm sure that, you know, they'll look after you extremely well. And as someone who's published with them, you know, I can definitely vouch for that. So, Max, I just want to say this has been a really great start to my day. I know it's an end to your day. So it's 8 o'clock in the morning. We started talking for me, midnight for you. But, you know, it's great to catch up with you again. And I really will, you know, be there supporting you, supporting your book. And I know that so many other lesbians and feminists and women, and you never know, some men might actually.
God forbid.
But thanks, Max, for this conversation.
Thank you for doing this. It would be, I was really hoping they could get you. I'm glad it was you. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure.
Okay, well, that's my moment to shine, I suppose. Thank you very, very much, Julie at 8 in the morning and Max at midnight, for a very, very interesting conversation. I'm very pleased that we could actually have that. And as to your last question, Julie, to Max, you know, what do we wish for this book to happen? Well, of course, we wish everybody in the whole world to read it. It would also be really nice if it was translated, but as you know, a lot of this is out of our hands. And so we will actually, of course, make a great effort starting in Australia to have bookshops carry this book. But you know, from your own experiences, that this is not so easy, but we certainly will do that. But I think this book is also going to go by word by mouth. Like when we put it up on the Spinifex website for the first time, our website almost crashed
It is a true story. We had an incredible spike. We got this little thing, analysis thing that we can look up. And we had this incredible spike. Today we put detransition on. And people also started to order the book already. So I think it will get around. We will hope that there will be, people interviewing you, Max, if you are game to do more interviews. And of course, Julie is a favorite of all of us. So that was really very nice of Julie to do that. And you asked very good questions. And we will just do our, utmost to get this book around. And then, of course, in a month's time, we will publish Janice Raymond's book. And Janice, I know, has also been very important for you and for Kitty. And we publish her book. And that book will again caused a little spike on the Spinifex website. Not as big as yours, I have to say, actually, which is interesting. But Jan says in her book that she is probably the original TERF. She claims that label of the original TERF. And she really spells it out, what is going on and how misogynist and homophobic and everything it is. She also names a lot of the women, including you, Julie, who have been, no platformed and boycotted and whatever. So she has a section in a chapter where she has about 15 women and one man that she mentions who have really had to suffer for just speaking out about what they think is actually, right, really, and feminist. So that book, as I said, comes on the heels of yours. We will see if Amazon stocks it. They've actually put it up, but we don't know if that's going to last. So we know that we are up against patriarchy in all its forms and guises. And speaking about the right-wing press, it is still the case that in Australia, it is only the very right-wing newspaper, The Australian, with an albeit very, very good journalist, Bernard Lane, who dares bringing stories about the whole detrans stuff. Except when the Lancet published this week that, what was it? Women, not women, but bodies with a vagina, instead of saying women, that was going too far. And even the Age, our liberal newspaper, who normally takes a totally pro-trans side, they actually had an article about this. I mean, very mild and very this, that, and the other, but at least it's getting around. And so we really hope that many people, men and women, will gradually come to see that this whole transition and then detransition is really something that actually can be avoided by saying the old stuff which we've been saying since the 70s. We're talking about sex role stereotypes. When they wanted to put you in dresses, Max, when you were a child, that is a sex role stereotype. And we fought against this. We thought women can have all sorts of dresses and they can have pants. And nowadays, women politicians, they are having pants on. Nobody actually says anything. But it's sex role stereotypes that we are working against. And we have to say that again and again and again. And another fervent wish of mine, that I won't die before it's happening, is that to get rid of that stupid term gender identity. This feeling. I've got this feeling I am actually really a dog. I know it. I talk to my dog and I know that deep, and Rachel too, she talks to her dog, and deep inside us, we know we're really dogs. I mean, what is this? This whole idiocy, you can't say it any differently, that you say, talk about feelings in our bodies, what we think we are. So thank you very, very much, Max, for making yourself vulnerable also by writing this book, because there are personal bits in there. We thank you very greatly. Now, I just want to say some thank yous. I mean, first of all, obviously, to Julie for doing this wonderful conversation. Then to the writer, Max Robinson, And I know you put your heart and soul into these many drafts. And a big shout out to Kitty Robinson, your partner, without whom this book would not be as good as it is now, because Kitty is she's our guest editor for this book, and she is very much a very important part of making this book what it is, which is beautiful inside and beautiful outside. And so I want to thank Estelle Dish, who does the covers for our Spinifex short series. It's called Emergence, actually, her pattern. And I asked Max early on what colors you like, and you said blue and yellow and red. And it's a blue and red, very vibrant cover. So thanks to Estelle. Then thanks to Deb Snipson, our designer, who makes it into a beautiful cover with the lettering on it. The inside is also very beautifully typeset by Helen Christie, our fantastic this typesetter, who would sometimes drive crazy. And I have to say, when the copy that we sent you to proofread came back from you and Kitty and some other reader with so many stickers on it, I thought, oh God, only help us. But we didn't get any complaints, and it was all good. The book is better for it. Then Susan and I couldn't do anything without the other members of the Spinifex team. Pauline Hopkins, who together with us have been really influential in, editing your book and talking to you and Kitty about what should be changed, what not. So thank you to Pauline. Then to Caitlin, who does our social media, to Rachel in the picture, who is our guru for anything to do with promotions and IT, to Marilyn, who's our office manager, who makes sure the books get actually sent out, and to Sharon Murphy, who is the warehouse manager. So thank you very much to all of you. So I think this was a very important conversation to have. We hope that anybody who is viewing it, listening to it, will go and have a conversation with themselves and their friends, and buy the book, of course, and spread the word. And Susan is giving me a sign. Have I forgotten something? Oh, Dashi. Yes, we are all into dogs. I mean, do take that very seriously about what I said about dog identity. In fact, Julie, what's your self-identity? Do you have a self-identity too?
Yes,
So
today I'm a geek cabinet, I think.
Right. But you can see now Dashi's Rachel's office assistant, and without her, without him, sorry, the boy actually can't help it. And nothing much would happen. Our dog has gone somewhere else. But it's probably time to finish this very friendly conversation. We are now going to have a gin and tonic, and well, I don't know what you're going to do, Max. You're probably going to go to bed and sleep. And happy new day to you, Julie. Thank you very much to all of you for this.